third webinar of the University of Minnesota Extension Beef Genetics webinar series. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Eric Mosel. He is the Extension Cow-Calf Management Educator for the University of Minnesota, and he'll be speaking on heifer economics and finance. Before we get started, we want to let everyone on Zoom tonight, as well as those attendees watching on Facebook Live, know that we appreciate your questions and look forward to engaging with you throughout tonight's presentation. So if we could advance to the next slide, please. And Brenda, if you want to go ahead and launch our first poll. Our first poll has just been put up, and we'd like to know where everyone is joining us from. We also want to know how long you've been in the beef industry so that we can best tailor tonight's presentation to our audience. And just as a gentle reminder, I'm sure you guys have seen this a bajillion times, but you can provide feedback in a bunch of different ways. You can use the mute button to unmute yourself and ask questions, engage our speaker. You can use the space bar to, you can press down on it in order to unmute yourself, and then when you release, it mutes you again. You can also send messages through the chat box, or you can send a direct message, either myself, Stacy, or Troy, and we can ask your questions to our presenter. If we can move on to our next slide, please.
Hold on. I'm stuck.
Oh. No, go back. All right, this is the UMN Beef team. There's me, Dana Adams, local extension livestock educator, Stearns, Benton, Morrison counties, Karen Johnson in McLeod, Meeker, and Wright counties, Dr. Joe Armstrong, who is our cattle production systems extension educator, Stacy Cahy, extension BQA program associate, Heather Default, Polk and Norman counties extension educator, Brendan Miller, Todd County extension educator, Dr. Mosel, our speaker tonight, cow-calf management extension educator, Melissa Runk, Pipestone and Murray counties extension educator, Troy Salzer, St. Louis County extension educator, and Terry Young, Hubbard County extension educator. If we can move on to our next slide. Go ahead, Troy.
Thank you, Dana. This evening, we are very excited to have Dr. Mosel here with us. As Dana had suggested, he is our Extension Cow-Calf Management Educator for the state of Minnesota. Eric organizes several statewide programs related to cow-calf management, such as Cow-Calf Days, as well as the Minnesota Grazing School and the Northern States Beef Roundup. He is a native of Nebraska and has attended the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. In addition to this, Dr. Mosel and his family raise livestock in northern Minnesota and has a very practical sense of some of the topics, such as this evening's topic. And so we're very excited and honored to have him presenting heifer economics and finance. Take it away, Eric.
Thank you, Troy, for that glorious introduction. I appreciate it. And of course, most people on here, I probably know from Cow-Calf Days. They know me. If you don't, I'm located up at the Grand Rapids station. And as Troy mentioned, my wife and I farm about 20 miles south of Grand Rapids. And I appreciate everybody being here tonight and appreciate the invite to visit a little bit. Was asked to talk about replacement heifer economics and finance. And I think that's a very appropriate topic considering where we're at in the markets right now, because for many, I think this has already started to stir some thoughts and some thinking a little bit about what some possibilities are. So let's start out just talking a little bit about the fact that clearly replacement heifers are a major cost for cow-calf producers. In the typical cow-calf operation, 50 to 20-ish% of your annual cash outlay is for developing replacement heifers. And a lot of people may be surprised by that, but there is some significant expenditures associated with developing replacements. And, you know, typically in the north here, we raise a lot of our own replacements. That's fairly standard across cow-calf outfits. That typically is not the case in many other places in the US where replacement heifers are often purchased for various reasons, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But even up here in the north, at certain times, buying bred replacements can be an attractive alternative to some of the things that are associated with developing your own replacement heifers. And that's a little bit what we're going to talk about tonight. And so as we think about this, you know, selecting the most economical source of replacements is going to have major implications for any cow-calf outfit. It doesn't matter how big or how small the operation is. It's a tremendous amount of resources that go into developing these heifers. And oftentimes I think it's useful for any outfit to revisit that topic occasionally and look at the resources that are being expended upon that, on these replacements, and does it still make sense, whatever the case is that you are currently doing. So I want to narrow this down pretty specifically tonight, just to visit with you about, does it really make sense to buy bred replacements rather than develop them, or vice versa? So let's talk about just a few of the factors that we need to consider when we think about replacement heifers. We got to think about feed costs and availability. Obviously, availability for a lot of folks this year in terms of feed may have been somewhat limited depending on where in the state you are. Infrastructure, I think, is a limitation for a lot of cow-calf outfits, just in terms of having a place to develop these heifer calves into replacements, and then having the labor to do it. When we think about the alternatives of buying bred replacements, we got to look at, okay, well, what do they cost, for one? And number two, is there a consistently available source of the type of replacements that we're looking for? And sometimes that can really be one of the main issues that drives this decision-making process. Is even if the price makes sense and many of these other factors line up, finding the type of heifers that you're looking for can sometimes, on a consistent basis, can sometimes be a little bit difficult. And then, as we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, from a purely financial standpoint, whether it makes sense or not to buy instead of raise your own, or vice versa, really depends on where you're at in the current market cycle. And so what I'm talking about is, you know, folks are familiar with the cattle cycle that typically covers 10 to 12 years, where we have a period where prices increase over approximately 3 to 5 years. We hit a high, and then as the herd expands, prices, the market prices start to drop off, and we go through that cycle repeatedly. And, you know, from high to high or low to low, however you look at it, is typically about 10 to 12 years. And so, as you might expect, that right now our position in the market cycle is really just coming off, you know, probably the lows of the cycle, and we're anticipating some point in the not too distant future that prices will start to, well, they have started to rise they are going to start to rise dramatically as we move into some of the market highs for the cycle, which, depending on who you're talking to, is with, probably 12 to 24 months out. And we'll touch on that a little bit more here in a minute. So what are some of the advantages of developing our own replacements? I think for a lot of folks, it's the genetic control and being able to make the decisions that they want to make from a breeding perspective. Understanding the background of the cattle is a key component for a lot of folks, and just understanding where, genetically where those cattle came from a health perspective, where they came from, and those types of things is typically pretty important to most producers. Disease control is always going to be a concern anytime we weigh the options of developing replacements out of our own herd or bringing in cattle from other sources. When we think about things like Ionis or BLV or any of those types of situations, we have to be cognizant of those types of things. Obviously, there's ways around that. There's ways that we can be confident in, the background of the cattle that we're bringing in from a health perspective, but obviously it's something that we're going to have to be concerned about. And then, of course, our cost, if we're developing heifers from our own herd, the cost of us developing them versus what they're bringing in the marketplace is going to be of importance. And then if we kind of switch that a little bit and talk about some of the advantages of buying replacement females, well, the first thing it's going to do is, we're going to need at least one less bull, which for some folks is significant. What I think is probably one of the key advantages to buying replacement females is the fact that it gives us tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of our genetic goals. And so if you think about it, anytime that we develop our own replacements out of our own herd, when we select sires to breed to, there has to be some level of selection for maternal traits, because we are going to be primarily interested with being able to take calves out of that calf crop and turn them into, eventually turn them into cows. And so we have to have at least some awareness of maternal traits. If we're buying in replacements from another reputable source, then we don't need to be as concerned about some of these maternal traits, and we can focus on other things that maybe we feel that we can capitalize economically upon. And so I think that's a huge advantage if you're in the situation where buying replacements works for you. For some, it's going to be, if you look at number 3 there, some it's going to be the possibility of being able to speed up herd expansion. And at certain times in the market cycle, that is a fairly important point for some outfits. And then, as we alluded to earlier, it may actually cost less at certain points in the market cycle to buy replacement heifers rather than raise them ourselves, depending on what our costs are and what our goals are and things like that. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of a kind of a budget of, on average, what it costs to develop replacement heifers in using Minnesota averages. And let me back that up there. So we're going to break this into a couple of parts just to give you a better idea of where some of these costs are coming from. And so the first part is going to be looking at our typical calf cow cost from breeding to weaning. So just as an example, if we looked at this particular example where we're looking at about 600, just a little less than $650 of total operating expenses, and then about $146 of fixed costs. Our total costs there for developing a calf to weaning would be just shy of $800, and that's the Minnesota state average. Now, if we're going to pull some calves out of that group to develop for replacements, our next period economically that we're going to look at is from weeding to breeding. And so you can see there that the additional time from December to May is going to be, for operating expenses, is going to be about just a little less than $445. We'll have fixed costs of about $80. And so we add an extra, basically $5.25 to the cost of developing that replacement. And so our total development cost to breeding is about $1,320 on average. All right. And this is a significant point in the accounting cycle to differentiate, because when we look at determining cow cost is determined from breeding to weaning. And so once this heifer enters the breeding phase, she actually shifts over to a different accounting category. So when we talk about developing these heifers, $1,320 is a number that we want to keep in mind as the average cost of developing. But I want to throw this at you as well, just for some discussion a little bit later on, is what if, as the market starts to rise, we're going to be faced with a situation where it could be advantageous to breed these heifers, hang on to them, and market them as breds later on going into December. And so if you look at this next slide, this is the cost profile on average. If we wanted to do something like that, we would add an extra approximately $400 to the cost of developing that replacement heifer through breeding all the way to December. And at that point, we would have about $1,700 into that heifer if we were looking to market that heifer as a bred at that point. That's about where we would be at. So the point is if you look at this, there's always some decisions to be made, particularly as we move into the phase of the market cycle that we're in right now. And so as you look at this slide here, I know it's not very neat, but this was kind of really where I thought maybe was the best way to display this. So as you look at this in terms of rows, not necessarily columns. So at the top there, we're going to have a weaned calf cost of $795, which is what we saw on the last slide there. And hang on just a second here, because part of my slide is covered here, and I want to take a look at that. There we go. All right, so weaned calf cost $795. Now currently, roughly where we're at is that heifer calf at weaning, let's call it 525 at $1.68. So she's worth about $882. And so our current net return on that heifer calf would be somewhere around, $85, $90, which is pretty typical right now. All right. Now, the second thing to look at there is if that heifer calf was backgrounded for 90 days, and let's say we get her up to about 700 pounds, and she'd bring, roughly $1.50 at that point. And so we'd have our gross return on that would be about $1,080. We're going to have some feed cost and yardage in there. Let's call that $90. And so our net return on that heifer calf would be just a little bit under $200. Okay, so that's pretty decent. And now if we think about that in terms of holding that heifer until December, and selling her as a bred, well, in December of 21, they were bringing, give or take $1,800. We had $1,700 in her. So the net return on that bred heifer was, you know, if we did sell her in December, that would have been somewhere around, you know, $85 or so. So the point being that in the current where we're at right today in the market cycle, there's not a tremendous amount of incentive to develop these heifers to the point of selling them as breds. We would be far more advantageous in most situations to just go ahead and hang on to those heifers as our own replacements. However, as we see every year, or not every year, but every cycle in the marketplace, we get to a point, and so let's think about this maybe a year or two from now, when prices have increased to a certain degree. And so, you know, let's do our normal about a 1.5% inflation on the calf cost. So now we're at about 805. And we're going to call that heifer 525 at 208 a couple years from now. So now let's say she's worth somewhere around $1,090. And so that would give us a net return on that calf if we sold her at weaning of you know, now we're around $280 or $90. If we backgrounded her for 90 days and, you know, she was worth maybe as a 7 weight, about $1.87 or so, we'd be looking about $1,320 gross. We'll inflate the feed cost and yardage a bit to $100. And now we're looking at a net return on a backgrounded heifer calf of about $415. And then if we take it one step further and we looked at that bred heifer and we carry her out to December, and you know, it's there's no way to predict what they'd be bringing, but history would tell us that they would be somewhere in that 2,000 to 2,200 range. And we have our $1,700 development cost. And so now, you know, we're knocking on the door of $500 return on selling bred heifers. And that a lot of times is where we see commercial operators in particular start to get very interested in developing bred heifers for sale. So as we look at that, the most likely scenario that we have seen historically is that when these heifer calves can be sold either as calves or feeders or breds at a substantial markup, the first thing we see is outfits stop developing replacements. And then we see the cow herd start to get pretty old. The herd output begins to drop off in a couple of years. And then finally, as we start coming off the market highs and prices start to fall, we become less interested in developing those females into replacements for sale. But we're at the point where substantial capital is going to be needed to start updating the herd. And that's a pretty typical scenario that we see in cow-calf outfits as we kind of move through the market cycle. So one of the things, I know this is a lot to look at here, but you know, really, if you want to understand the economics and finance of replacement heifers, which is a significant portion of any cow-calf outfit, we need to at least in part address this. And so what this is just simply looking at the projections of the value of replacement heifers into the future. And this is, you know, this is pretty basic finance, but I think it's fairly important to look through this just to give us an idea of where we are currently in terms of the value of these replacements and where potentially they could be going. So just to make this as simple as possible, if you look across the top of this chart, we've got the columns numbered 1 through 9. If you look over on the right side, the rows are lettered A through N. And typically, really all this is showing is the development of this female through her productive life cycle, starting in 22 with a development cost of $1,320, where we were in our previous budget. And just simply looking at that throughout the years of her productive life. The key points to look at within the chart are simply, if you look at column 7 there, looking at our net return by year, and recognizing that the net returns on these females are not static by any means. I think most people understand that, but recognizing that they increase with time and then they start to decrease as we move closer to the end of that productive life. As you look at column 8, you might be wondering what a discount is. Well, when we look at the value of any investment going into the future, we have to recognize that money in the future is worth less than it is today due to inflation. And for this particular analysis, which I worked on this afternoon, of course, we have some very significant inflationary events going on in the world right now. However, I think it's still appropriate, at least at this early stage, to maintain, from a finance perspective, maintain an annual inflation rate of somewhere around 2%. And so that is what I have included in column 8 there. And so basically all we're doing is we're just discounting the net returns by year of the production from these heifers through 7 years. And then when we look at row J, looking there on the right, row J, we're going to look at the sum of the annual returns from that female. Row K is simply the value of her as a cull cow, which would be $910, discounted 7 years into the future. So her value today would be somewhere around $790. And so what that does is that shows us that over the lifetime of this investment in this female, given that we developed her for $1,320, our net return would be somewhere around $135 when it's all said and done. And the significant portion of that is that generates a rate of return on that investment of about 10.25%, which is probably better than most of our mutual funds are doing, at least so far this year. So that's a pretty significant return, and that means that at least in this example scenario, you know, that's an appropriate amount to spend on developing replacements. They will generate a return, a positive return over the life of the investment. Now, what invariably is going to come up, which we have seen already, is if we look at this next one, this is the exact same analysis, except for if you look at row B in column 9, we have spent $1,800 on investing in a replacement heifer. And if we follow column 9 down, we will see that the net return over the 7 years of the life of that investment is a negative number. And so basically that's what that's telling us, is that even as you look forward to a little bit stronger market going through the next few years, there are going to be limits on how much we can invest in replacement females that are actually going to return positively on that investment. And we want to be aware of that. And so there's always opportunities in there to add value to the calves out of these females. And so as you sit there, you might be wondering, well, you know, we see heifers in this bred heifers in the sale barns sell for $2,000 or $2,500 all day long. How's that even possible? Well, there's a couple of financial tricks that go along with that, but primarily I think what drives a lot of that is just the folks that are able to purchase those heifers are adding value to that calf crop in some sort through either backgrounding or actually finishing them out in those types of situations. So what we're talking about here is just the net present value at weaning. And so we need to be aware that that's kind of, those are kind of the breaks financially in that type of scenario. And so just a couple of final thoughts. There's a lot of reasons an outfit may decide to buy replacements rather than developing their own. And I think many of those reasons are justified. Like we said on the front end, facilities is a big component of that. Labor is a big component of that. And so, those types of decisions need to take those things into account. But what I would really impress upon our viewers tonight is the importance of knowing and figuring out what it costs for you to develop these replacements. That can be very advantageous to your decision-making process. And I know sometimes that's not always that simple to do, but spending the time and effort to consistently try and keep track of what it costs to do some of these things can make this decision-making process much easier. And then the number 3 thing I really want to impress upon people, particularly as we move into the next few years of potentially a lot better markets than we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, is that rising markets are full of perceptions and particularly speculators. And so be quite aware of that, particularly when you are on the buying side of that type of scenario. So that can be beneficial to us if we're on the selling side. But if you're in the market to buy or inadvertently put yourself in a position where you have to buy, just be aware that sometimes market values do not always reflect the actual economics of the investment. So with that, I appreciate everybody's attention. I'd be glad to answer any questions, address any comments. Complaints can go to Troy, and we can certainly move forward from there.
Thank you, Dr. Eric. I really appreciate that last comment. With that in mind, $5 to the best question here tonight.
Do we have
There
any?
was one question in the chat. Is there a certain size herd where it makes sense to raise versus purchase?
A certain size herd where it makes sense to raise versus purchase?
Yes.
I would say, just speaking on the average, most cow outfits are probably better off raising their own replacements. Where it becomes, where that maybe is an exception is in particularly small operations where the facilities, the time, so on and so forth, maybe don't lend themselves well to proper development of these replacements. And then in those scenarios, I think you definitely can probably justify, in most cases, just finding a reputable source and purchasing those replacements.
Eric, a question. Eric, a question I had was, in those calculations, where do the open heifer issues come into that calculation? Is that just generally it costs this many total gross dollars, they're uniformly divided out, and then you end up with 10% that don't breed or what have you? Where does that come into play?
So that's really not going to show up in these analyses, because if they did, that would be assuming that the cost of open females is not recoverable, which is not the case. Obviously, that's going to be recovered, but in a different ledger in the accounting book. And so we're not going to include costs of opens in these calculations, because those costs are recoverable. Does that make sense?
Yep.
I did have another question that came in the chat.
Sure.
What advantages and costs do you see using female sexed embryos for the purpose of replacement females in the herd?
So yeah, there probably are some scenarios where sex semen can be quite beneficial, particularly if you're in a situation where you're trying to expand rapidly, and maybe the economics or the financial situation does not allow for just simply buying those replacements. We could go ahead and breed them ourselves. However, there of course will be a cost associated with that in fewer marketable calves to sell, and that's going to have to be figured into the overall finance of that particular situation. So it's not a very clear answer, but it's going to be so situationally dependent. But of course, the main point is that, you know, I mean, heifers as feeders take a significant discount, and so stacking yourself with females by using sex semen is really only going to make sense if you have a reason to need to expand quite rapidly and take those females and develop them to breds. Otherwise, I don't know that it would make a tremendous amount of sense for most commercial outfits.
Looks like Kevin's got one in the chat, Eric. When you AI, are you getting better replacements than buying replacements from somebody else?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, yeah, you know, what if they're AI-ing too? Is Kevin suggesting that he's a better AIer than anybody else?
I think he's suggesting that
Recognizing that I'm just giving Kevin a hard time.
exactly. But I think, yeah, if you can, I mean, it's all about your genetics, right? I mean, if you AI and you feel like those genetics are the same or better than what you can buy, I mean, that's what it comes down to. I mean, a lot of times what you're looking for when you buy replacements from somebody at a high end is that they're better genetics than you have, right? So I think that it all depends on your herd goals and what you're trying to do and everything else.
Yeah, or even just a different combination of genetics than what you have traditionally done. And you know, maybe you're trying to change directions a little bit or whatever the scenario may be. So I don't want to pigeonhole folks into thinking that it's just about being better genetics. Sometimes it's just different than, or a different combination than maybe what you've been doing. But yeah, you're right, Joe. Yeah, exactly. And I know Kevin has superior genetics, so I won't give him too hard of a time.
Eric, I have another question that just recently came in. Could you elaborate on the difference between an operation that finishes out their own calves versus, and does that have any implications on whether or not you should consider purchasing replacements as compared to raising your own replacements?
Sure, I think that's probably the A prime example of where it makes a lot of sense to invest capital into buying replacements, as we talked about earlier, because then you don't have to have this at least partial focus on the maternal trades. We can forego a lot of that, let somebody else worry about that part and focus on our finishing program and the traits that will be able to optimize, focus on the traits that we think we can optimize the most cash value for. And so, as an example, we don't need to be nearly as concerned about things like birth weight, which, as we've talked about many times, I think is one of the main drivers of, calves that finish too early. Maybe not that they don't grade, because I mean, most anything will grade these days, but certainly you're leaving some mature weight on the, or at least finished weight on the table with some of these ultra calving ease light calves that certain programs are experiencing. So that's one of just several examples where that's, I think, is that's a good way around that type of scenario.
Eric, Clint just texted, when AIing yourself, can you use maternal genetics buying? They
think it's
might
just-
be, yeah.
Just a comment that if you're AIing yourself, you can make sure to choose maternal genetics,
Sure.
but when you're buying, they might be AI'd, but they're bred maternal or terminal. So he's just saying that you have more control over if you AI yourself potentially, right?
Yep.
One question I had for you, Eric, was that do you see groups or herds, especially when we're talking farmer feeders, people that finish out their own calves? Do you see them, if they want to raise their own replacements, do they identify groups of cows that they're going to use specifically for replacements, so they can have a genetic group where they say, okay, these 50 are going to be my replace, or what I'm going to choose to breed maternal genetics to, and everybody else I'm going to breed terminal? Do you see that breaking down and see any advantage to it?
So in my experience, that's pretty rare. It does happen for sure. You have to have a herd size of a certain amount to really make that work very effectively. Most folks don't have that many cows. And so that's probably not a real productive management strategy to use. However, to your point specifically, yes, when you do have a critical mass of cows to do that, that's quite an effective way to manage that particular scenario, and have basically a herd that's committed primarily to developing replacements, and everything else is largely bred for terminal traits. And once upon a time, I used to know what the breakdown in terms of the number of cows you needed to effectively do that, but it escapes me right now.
I think Rick Funston says it's around 200.
Yeah,
And I think that's the number that's coming to my head, and I think
Yeah.
that's what it is. The last time, now that's Nebraska, so nothing against Nebraska, Eric, but it's not Minnesota, so it's a different setup, but that's the number that comes out of Nebraska. So
Yeah.
I did have a question that came in the chat. Does it make sense to buy open heifers and breed them yourself?
So I think there is a lot of scenarios where that makes a lot of sense. However, the reality is that if you have the facilities, the time, the feed, and the financing to do that, it would probably make more sense just to develop your own. Unless there was something particular about those open heifers that you are not able to acquire through your own breeding genetics program, so on and so forth. So I think yes, I do think that that is a possibility for some folks, but it typically has to be very, what's the word, goal oriented to really justify doing that. Otherwise, you're kind of just trading dollars there. So if you're going to do that, you're going to be trading dollars for some genetic component or something that would justify trading your heifer calves in for somebody else's to develop as replacements.
I'd be real careful too about when you buy those and why they're open, because sometimes they're open for a reason. So yeah,
I mean, anytime you buy heifer calves, you're buying somebody's second cut. So you got to
exactly. So just be careful. Maybe make sure if there's someone there that knows what they're doing to arm them, and make sure they're not just a group of free martins that you bought or something like that.
So I think that we have a raised hand. Clint, did you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, Dr. Mosel, it isn't really a question. It's one of the other ones asked the question about, is it pay to raise your own heifers or buy them, you know, if you're a smaller herd, or what size it is. Around here, I have people that ask that question all the time, and kind of my advice to it, and you just for discussion, you know, so if you got 30 cows and you're gonna probably keep 7, 8, 9, 10 heifers these guys are keeping, now they need a heifer bull. Okay, and even if you're gonna AI, you still need a heifer bull to clean up or whatever you're gonna do. Well, to buy a bull to clean up 7, 8, 10 heifers each year, you probably can use them on some of your cows a little bit, but I think you give up too many pounds. And especially when we're moving into the cycle where we could possibly gain some margin on these cattle, and giving up some of them pounds with these heifer bulls, I don't know. So that's, I guess, what I kind of tell them is, if you're only keeping, you know, 10 or less, to think about that a little bit. I just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Oh, I think there's a lot of merit to that, and I'm glad you brought that up, Clint. That's a very real world scenario for a lot of folks, you know, particularly where you and I are at, and that's certainly something that needs to be taken into consideration, because, you know, as I pointed out earlier in the program here, that, you know, one of the big things that has to be considered is the fact that you know, even if you only have 7 replacements, you're probably going to have a bull for them. And yes, some of that may be able to be spread amongst the cow herd too, but not always, depending on where you're at and what you're trying to accomplish. And so it certainly begs the question, and probably the analysis of, well, does it actually just make more sense to go to Clint and buy some of his heifers? I just gave you a plug there and you didn't even say thanks. That really disappoints me, Clint.
No, thank you very much, but that wasn't what I was after.
I know. I'm just giving you a hard time, but no, I do appreciate the comment, because that's a very real thing that most folks in this area are dealing with, or will come across. And I think that's a very appropriate thing to at least think about. Given that set of circumstances, does it really make sense that I keep 6 or 7 replacement heifers and go through everything that is required in that, or could I just purchase some comparable breds and just be done with it? I mean, we could certainly go through the financial analysis of that, but just off the top of my head, it's probably about a wash. Man, folks have some good questions tonight. I think that $5, Troy, really got them going.
So who gets it tonight, Eric?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't watching the chat box. That's your guys' job, but
Okay.
I think we might have to give it to Clint.
I think so too.
Just because he was willing to unmute and talk. And yeah, he got a plug out of it, but he might get the $5 as well.
So I'll defer to somebody else.
But no, thanks to everybody for all the good questions. Those are all really important things to be considering for this particular topic.
So with that in mind, Eric, I really appreciate you taking your time this evening and the rest of the beef team and in putting this together. You had a great presentation. We'd like to thank you in relationship to presenting on the heifer economics and finance. This presentation has been recorded and will be it was shared on the Todd County Facebook page, as well as it will be sent out to you as well in a link so that you can review this after this series is completed. We will also have Brenda go ahead and display the last poll. If you could fill that out, that'll help us in relationship to getting additional information. And we will ask you to join us next Monday, the 14th, also at 8:00 p.m. And that will be when we'll be looking at bull breeding, soundness exams, and bull health. That will be with Dr. Joe Armstrong, and we're looking forward to his presentation as well. Thank you, Dr. Mosel, and his contact information is up, as well as don't hesitate to reach out to any one of the other teammates as well in regards to that. So with that, thanks again for joining us, and we hope that you have a good week.